Welcome again to the Gospel of Mark. My name is John Robbins. I'm thankful for your presence once again. We're concluding in the next couple of weeks, most likely, the Gospel of Mark, and then we're going to move on to another book of the Bible. I'm going to go ahead and let you know what that is because I think it's important to get yourself prepared for that. I want to study another gospel because I think it's important that we really delve into the life and mission and ministry of Jesus Christ. But we're going to look at a gospel that is radically different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that is the Gospel of John. John is different in many, many different ways. John's portrayal of Jesus is radically different from what we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For example, there are no parables in the Gospel of John. There's a lot of metaphorical language we find in John that we don't find in the other Gospels, for example. So in the next few weeks, we're going to start with the Gospel of John, but we have yet to conclude the Gospel of Mark. So let's go back and deal with briefly what we talked about last week, and then we'll go right along. We are not going to finish the Gospel of Mark tonight, that's for sure. But I want you to be aware of what we dealt with last week to put in proper context where we are this week. You will recall, of course, that Jesus has participated in the Passover meal with the disciples. They've gotten everything in order, and then Jesus, during the Passover meal, says something dramatically different from what it is that was expected, and that Jesus takes the bread and the cup and says, "This is my body and this is my blood." These are the words of institution that Jesus offers up that we find in the Gospel of Mark that are, of course, very different from any words that the disciples would have expected from Jesus. Then Jesus says in his own way that there are going to be those who deny him and betray him and abandon him. And Peter stands up boldly and declares, "I will not be the one that does anything like that." In fact, all of them say the same thing. I'm not going to be the one that denies you. But what we find to be real interesting about that is that they all ask themselves fundamentally the question when Jesus says, there is one who will betray me, there's one who will deny me, they all in their own way say, could it possibly be me? Instead of emphatically saying it's not going to be me, they even to some degree question in their own mind whether or not they might be the one. It shows again from Mark's perspective the level of doubt on the part of the disciples regarding who Jesus is, even this late in his ministry. Then Jesus goes into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, and he is terrified, to say the least. And he asks his disciples to remain with him and to stay awake with him during his time of prayer, and they're unwilling and unable to do so. Jesus is left alone. In the midst of his fear and the terror that surrounds him, Jesus has been, even though the disciples are close by, he has been abandoned by them. Then, as we know, Judas Iscariot is going to kiss Jesus, and in the process of doing so, show to those who have come to arrest him just exactly who Jesus is, which one he happens to be in the crowd of people. It is what we call the kiss of death. It is this intimate action between two men in a culture and day and time when that was very common, like a handshake today. It was an act of intimacy, and Judas turns that act of intimacy into a powerful form of betrayal. Jesus does not understand why they've come with clubs and weapons as if somehow he is a common criminal. But they do, and they approach Jesus ready to carry him away. And today we begin with the 51st verse of the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. This rather unusual couple of verses that we see in Mark. So remember, Jesus has just been taken away. He has been arrested by the authorities, and they now desert him and they flee. In fact, in verse 50, it says, all of them deserted him and fled. All of them. Jesus is totally alone now. He has been abandoned. He has been betrayed by all those who claim to love him and would remain by his side under any circumstance or any condition. They have all fled and left him alone. So we begin with verse 51. A certain young man was following him, that is, following Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. Now, this little 2-verse section, this little what we call pericope, this portion of Scripture, is unique to the Gospel of Mark. Here is somebody who is essentially wearing a loincloth who is following Jesus. The authorities run after him, rip off the loincloth, but he manages to get away. Why is that there? Scholars really don't know. Who is this man wearing the loincloth? Scholars really don't know. There's been speculation that it might have been Peter or one of the other disciples, but we really don't know why Mark even includes this or what the significance is of it, but nevertheless, it's there. So we pick up with verse 53 as Jesus comes before the council. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards warming himself at the fire. So in Mark's gospel, the high priest is unnamed, but we see from other gospel accounts that he is identified as Caiaphas. And he is before the council. The council is what we call the Sanhedrin. For lack of a better way of saying it, would be the Jewish Supreme Court, if you will, the high court in the land. Now remember, all the disciples have abandoned him. Mark has already made that clear, but Peter is willing to follow along with the crowd, but he remains at a distance from Jesus. He wants to see what's going on, but he doesn't want to be a part of what's going on. And so here is Peter, who is watching at a distance. Now remember, Mark records these eyewitnesses' testimony, and that eyewitness happens to be Peter himself. So it is Peter describing the events that are taking place through the gospel writer Mark that we read about. And he's warming himself with the guards by the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. So they're trying to find evidence to support the notion that Jesus needs to be put to death. You cannot make up a story. There have to be enough witnesses to justify the death of another person. Remember, one of the commandments is you shall not bear false witness. And in the book of Deuteronomy as well, it says the same thing. And in Numbers chapter 35, verse 30, there is the need for at least 2 witnesses to justify any kind of corporal punishment against someone else. They're trying to find witnesses, people who can safely say and honestly say, this is what we've seen, trying to corroborate the stories that are present there. But they can't find those witnesses because what they want to do is claim Jesus to be a criminal to the nth degree and are unwilling and unable to find people who will justify that. For many gave false testimony against him, verse 56, and their testimony did not agree. Now remember, false testimony that doesn't agree holds no power or authority, but that is not going to dissuade the authorities from continuing to pursue the crucifixion of Jesus. Under normal circumstances, if there is not enough eyewitness testimony and the false testimony has been presented that doesn't match, one would be set free. But ironically, Jesus, who has done nothing, is not going to be freed. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.'" Now remember, of course, that nowhere in the gospel did Jesus ever claim that he will destroy the temple. He talks about the destruction of the temple, but Jesus never says he is the one who will destroy the temple. But there are those who are providing false testimony as if to say Jesus said himself that he would destroy the temple. But even on this point, their testimony did not agree. Wouldn't it seem logical that if continual testimony, one person after another, making statements, is not in agreement with anything else, then that person who has been charged should be set free or let go. But that is not going to be the case with Jesus. They are bent on making sure that he is put to death. And at this point, they're doing anything and everything they can to make sure that that happens, even offering up false testimony. Verse 59, but even on this point, their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, have you no answer? What is that they testify against you? But he was silent and did not answer. Now, if you look at the prophet Isaiah, if you'll flip to the prophet Isaiah, go ahead and take time to find it wherever you need to find it in your Bible. You're welcome to do so. Turn to chapter 53, and what we have in chapter 53 of the prophet Isaiah is a description of the suffering servant, the one who is to come, who is to suffer. Now look again at verse 61. It says, but he was silent and did not answer. They ask him questions, that is Jesus, and he refuses to answer. In chapter 53, verse 7, it says from the prophet Isaiah, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. So Isaiah prophesies about one who is the sacrificial lamb who would not open his mouth. At this point, it is clear in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus is leaving up the testimony of others as a way of identifying who he is. Even though it's false testimony, Jesus at this point is not willing to acknowledge who he is publicly the way the authorities want him to do it. He'll do it on his own terms, his own way. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. This is Jesus' clearest declaration in the Gospel of Mark regarding who he is, and that his ultimate vindication will come in his glory. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. It is a clear declaration about who Jesus is, and in Mark's Gospel, he declares himself to be so. He is the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, why do we still need witnesses? You've heard this blasphemy. What is your decision? All of them commended him as deserving death. All of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying to him, prophesy. The guards also took him over and beat him. So notice what happens here is that they can't put Jesus to death, so they try to charge him with sedition. That is, they try to charge him as one who is a rebel, if you will. He is a blasphemer in their eyes, declaring himself to be, ironically, just who he really is. And so they are ready to put him to death, which is also very ironic that you have religious authorities who are ready at any cost to put a man of peace and love and grace and forgiveness and mercy to death. Then they spit on him, which of course was meant to shame him. It is a shameful act on the part of these people who long in their own way to harm Jesus. This man is going to be brutalized, and he is undeserving, and yet it's going to happen. It is shameful on the part of those who would do something like that. In verse 66, while Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, remember he's sitting by the fire next to the guards, she stared at him and said, you also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth. But he denied it, saying, I do not know or understand what you are talking about. Remember how Jesus said that he would be denied, and how Peter boldly said, I will not deny you. I will take a bullet for you if necessary. And now there is one who says, you are with Jesus. And immediately, right away, Peter says, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. He denies knowledge of who Jesus is. And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed. And the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, this man, but again he denied it. Okay. After that, the little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, certainly you are one of them. You were a Galilean. But he began to curse and swore an oath. I do not know this man that you're talking about. At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said to him, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. It is a terrible betrayal on the part of Peter, denying Jesus 3 times. The cock has crowed. He doesn't know who Jesus is, he says. In fact, and the last time he does it, he says, go to hell, in essence. I swear I didn't know him. And so Peter is unwilling to risk anything, knowing that potentially he might be harmed if he is attached to Jesus in any way. And the cowardly part of Peter, the faithless part of Peter, is unwilling to stand up and do so, to publicly declare he knows who Jesus is and that he's in ministry with Jesus. And as a result, it is going to cost him dearly. But at this point, he simply breaks down and he begins to weep. Peter recognizes what he has done, how in his own way he has denied knowing who Jesus is. And the irony in all of this is Peter is the one who always says, I'm the one who will stand up for you. I'm the one that will be there for you. And the other disciples have abandoned him as well. I think sometimes we forget that the other disciples left. Peter denies Jesus. Judas betrays Jesus. But all the disciples abandon Jesus and leave him completely alone. So let's move on to chapter 15 as Jesus comes before Pontius Pilate. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Now, I find that interesting that they bind Jesus. That is, if you will, they handcuff Jesus and lead him away, and they hand him over to Pilate as if he is a common criminal, as if the torture that he is going to endure and the death is somehow more than appropriate for him. Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? He answered him, you say so. Then the chief priest accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, have you no answer? See how many charges they have brought against you? But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Pilate is amazed at the silence of Jesus. All these accusations against Jesus, all this false testimony, all of these people who are bent on doing nothing but making sure Jesus is put to death, continue to talk and squalor and holler and do whatever it is that they feel like they need to do to make sure Jesus is put to death. And Jesus just simply has enough self-control that he remains silent. Now, at the festival, he used to release a prisoner. That is, Pilate used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. That was kind of a gesture of support on the part of Pilate, that every year, a goodwill gesture, if you will, to let someone go who had been imprisoned for whatever reason. Now, a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priest had handed him over. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. Then what do you wish for me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews? They shouted back, crucify him. Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Now look at the number of absolute stooges in this story. That is, people who are so cowardly that they'll do anything to protect themselves. Even Pilate himself doesn't want any kind of insurrection. He doesn't want any kind of riot. So Pilate said, "Who do you want me to release for you as a goodwill gesture?" We do that every year, thinking it would be someone like Jesus. "You want me to release the one you call King of the Jews?" The irony is, of course, they don't call him King of the Jews, even though he is King of the Jews. And they say, "No, crucify him. We want Barabbas to be released." Barabbas was a murderer, part of an insurrection. Pilate goes back. "How about if I release the King of the Jews? I can't find that he's done anything wrong." And they shout, "Crucify him." And instead of Pilate saying, "This man has done nothing wrong, this man named Jesus, I'm going to release him whether you like it or not," he's worried about what might happen. So he is another coward in this saga. And as a result, they release Barabbas. Pilate has Jesus turned over to those who now seek to brutalize him and put him to death. Cowards all over the place. And Jesus is the one who will pay the price as a result. False testimony, Jesus should have been released. In fact, in the culture in which Jesus found himself in that day and time in Judaism, capital punishment, putting somebody to death, was something that was almost unheard of in many instances. There had to be so much eyewitness testimony. There had to be overwhelming evidence. There is no eyewitness testimony. There is no overwhelming evidence. And Jesus is clearly innocent. Even the authority, Pilate, recognizes that. But all along the way, he continues to move toward the cross. Jesus would say this is part of God's plan. It's going to have to take place. Just from a different perspective, a human perspective, Jesus is surrounded by people who are cowards, who are simply out to save themselves at any cost, including the death of Jesus. Verse 16. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloak. Now, purple was a sign of royalty. So this really is just to mock Jesus, to make fun of him. He's King of the Jews. Let's put a purple robe on him. And after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. I can assure you they didn't put it on his head, as in gently place it upon his head. He has a crown made out of thorns. They would have crushed it down upon his head, which would have caused him to bleed, of course. So they've spit on him, they've laughed at him, they've flogged him, they've beaten him, they've covered him, stripped him, they've now covered him in a purple robe, they've crushed a crown of thorns down upon his head, blood pouring down his cheeks, down the sides of his face, over his ears. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. And after mocking him, they stripped him of his purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. And they led him out to crucify him. Now, this is a horrible, horrible act. The mockery, the spitting, the laughing. This is a human being who is being put to death, who is going to be tortured before he is ever killed. And there is enough evil present that people laugh at him and mock him as he suffers. The notion that another human being could suffer before our eyes and we could laugh it off and make fun and spit and do all the things that are being done toward Jesus causes all of us, I think, to step back and realize the power we have as human beings to dehumanize someone else, someone we don't like, to such a degree that we find pleasure and joy in their suffering. I would hope and pray that I would never be that way. But sometimes it makes me wonder, because a lot of these people are religious folk. They love the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh, or at least they claim to love God. They seem to believe that somehow they're protecting their faith when in fact what they're doing is destroying a life, taking the life of the Savior of the world, the one who is indeed King of the Jews. Now let's go a little bit further. We're going to talk more at length about all of this next week. Then verse 21, they compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. Now in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Simon of Cyrene carries the cross for Jesus up to Golgotha, place of the skull, otherwise known as Calvary. In the Gospel of John, Jesus carries the cross himself. It says, it was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. So evidently, Alexander and Rufus must have been known in the early church that Mark writes to. Why would he include their names otherwise, this Alexander and Rufus? Evidently, the early church knew who Alexander and Rufus were. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. Now, it was customary in Jesus' day and time to crucify people by busy roads where people could witness the suffering and the death. It was considered to be a great deterrent. If you were contemplating maybe stealing or putting somebody to death or anything else, and you see someone who is being crucified for having done whatever it is you're considering doing, it would cause you to consider twice whether or not you really ought to do that. It was considered a great deterrent, and I'm sure that it must have been. Now we're going to see in Mark's gospel that the brevity of the crucifixion is unique to Mark's gospel. But all the gospels are brief when it comes to crucifixion details. And notice verse 24, and they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. There is not a lot of description, there's not a lot of detail in Mark's gospel about the crucifixion itself, and there's a reason for that. It was so brutal, so heinous, so awful, that Mark, I think, like the other gospel writers, is trying to spare people of the gruesome details. C.S. Lewis said that no Christian wore a cross around her or his neck until any Christian who had actually seen a real crucifixion had died. In other words, it was such a brutal act, the cross itself, that no one would have worn a cross to symbolize that kind of brutality who had actually witnessed a crucifixion. Now, we're going to talk in detail about the crucifixion next week. So I want you to know that if you have a queasy stomach at all, you might want to turn down the volume next week just a little bit. I don't want to talk in detail about that just to bring up gruesome kinds of things, but I think it's important for us to talk about what it is Jesus goes through, the incredible level of suffering that he is going to endure, and what the crucifixion entails. So we'll talk more about that next week, but we're going to stop right here tonight. Again, I'm grateful for your presence as a part of our Bible study. We're going to come close probably to finishing the Gospel of Mark next week, and we might very well finish the Gospel of Mark next week. But one way or another, we'll move into the Gospel of John after that. I'm very excited about John. It is a wonderful gospel to study. It is radically different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which will be good for us as we go into another book of the Bible. So thanks for being a part of Bible study tonight, and I hope that you have a blessed rest of the week.